Hello everyone, this is going to be an overview of all that I have covered in the Perception series. This is going to be a video where you can watch the whole thing without any interruptions of going from one video to the next. So this is basically just me covering all that I've covered so far. The question for the video is going to be, what is perception and its implications? So before I get into it, I have to really cover some definitions here. Otherwise, you guys are going to be lost at what I'm talking about later. So I will provide timestamps on these things so you can look in the description and try and figure out what word I'm using and also the definition for that word. So first up, what is perception? Perception is the way we approach information. What do I mean by approach? I mean our reaction to information. What is information? Information is the conscious, unconscious, and semi-conscious things that are a production of what comes in and affects our mind. Conscious, information we can view, which are automatic, passive, and neutral, which are our senses. Semi-conscious, information in the form of questions or choice between a dichotomy or other options that are manual, semi-active, and positive, which are our ideas. Unconscious, information that we do not have direct access to, which are automatic, active, and negative, which are our conclusions. Mind, the experience of being human in view of first-person narrative in which our will and intellect is manifest. Now let's cover definitions of automatic and manual, which are how much time and effort of the mind is required for occurrences of these things, where automatic takes the least amount of time and effort and manual takes the most time and effort. Passive, semi-active, and active. How much influence is made on our ideas when passive has an automatic effect, semi-active has an indirect effect, and active has a direct effect. Neutral, positive, and negative. How much influence is made on our conclusions where neutral has an indirect effect, positive has a direct effect, and negative has no effect. Senses, immediate nature of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, pressure, and temperature. It also is our behaviors. Ideas, contemplative nature of things passing from the conscious to the unconscious processes. Conclusions, the prescriptive nature of what makes up our worldview that is not made available to our conscious mind. There is an ideal path of perception that I want to cover, so let me explain that. The path of our perception starts with our senses and what they pick up about our environment or external world. What we pick up with our senses is something that is interpreted by our ideas. Senses have a two-way street between our external world and our ideas. Ideas have to interpret our senses into something that makes sense. Our interpretation of senses is often questioning what our senses are picking up about the external world. Our ideas posit questions of the implications of the external world by the use of time and effort of the mind. These questions get answered and then become what makes up our conclusions. Our conclusions are what makes up our worldview. We do not have intimate knowledge of our exact worldview because our biases and conclusions are only secondary to inform our consciousness. The way our conclusions do influence our consciousness is by informing our ideas, which are semi-conscious. Ideas question our worldview. Our ideas then contemplate what the implications are to our conclusions. Then our conclusions come up with answers to what our secondary ideas are about our first ideas that come up from our consciousness. When we have settled on our conclusions, then this influences our senses. So our senses have a two-way path between our ideas, and our ideas have a two-way path between our conclusions, and our conclusions have a one-way path to our senses, which is how we act in the world. The question of ideas. Our ideas are not strictly conscious or unconscious, but oscillate between conscious intellect and unconscious intellect. Earlier I said ideas are the passing of consciousness to the unconsciousness, and that this happens through the mechanism of ideas. Our ideas are how the mind translates our external world into our worldview. In the first level of ideas, we are asking the question about what our senses communicate to us. we often ask basic questions like what, who, and where. This is where our ideas are the most neutral, and the more neutral a thing is in the mind, the less direct influence it has on our conclusions that are therefore our worldview. Questions of what, who, and where are the most automatic reactions we might have to our conscious mind. The more automatic the idea, the less positive it is. At the same time, the more automatic the idea is in the first level of ideas, the more active it is in the second level of ideas. This is because our ideas are filtered through our conclusions. Our automatic ideas are often answered automatically by our conclusions. But once our conclusions are made, we often have a secondary response to unconscious thoughts. That is when our ideas come up with secondary questions like when, how, and why. Our secondary ideas are much more positive than our first ideas. This is because our secondary ideas are much more manual than automatic. The more manual an idea is, the less active it is, and the more positive it is. We have free will, but how we have free will is a bit hard to explain. Our free will is based on our ideas. We exercise free will upon a couple qualifications. First, it must be understood the degree to which our conclusions influence our conscious thoughts. Upon the finishing of a conclusion, this causes us to act in the world with a behavior. Our behaviors are a manifestation of conscious thought. Our senses are constantly being exposed to new things in the external world, but many of our conclusions remain the same. This is because so few things our senses pick up in the external world contradict things about our conclusions. However, our senses are always filtered through our ideas. So it is only natural that our ideas reflect what our senses pick up in the external world. But because there are so few conscious things that contradict our conclusions, we often maintain our conclusions. But when our senses pick up something particularly different than what our conclusions are, our ideas question things in a way that our conclusions cannot rightly make sense of. But it is not so much the first level of ideas that makes us come up with new conclusions, but the second level of ideas that do this. This is because the more manual the idea is, the more time and effort it takes to work through them. There becomes a point when, due to the manual nature of our ideas, we struggle with our first level conclusions. When this happens, we exercise our free will to determine what we do with these new ideas. This is when our most manual ideas change our conclusions, that our free will is enacted. How does God fit into perception? It is that the more freer our ideas are, the more conclusions are challenged, the more that God is influencing factor in our perceptions. So while we cannot directly control our senses, we can enact our free will with our ideas to produce new conclusions. So it is when we get to the very heart of our ideas is when our free will is enacted. So we might say our free will is exactly the thing that God uses to influence us. Some people might enact their free will to turn away from God, while others might enact their free will to turn toward God. This is demonstrated very clearly in the Bible verse Proverbs 16:9, which states, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." If you look at the Hebrew behind this verse, it can basically be stated like this: the mind of man thinks about what he will do, but ultimately it is God who determines what his behaviors will be. From this we can see implications that God predestines us either to follow him or to turn away from him. Both are done for his glory, and both are a complete act of free will. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Talk to you later. Bye.